It might be a coworker who undermines you, a family member who never seems to understand you, or even a stranger who looks at you the wrong way. In those moments, the heart burns with resentment. The mind whispers, "This person is against me. They are my enemy." But pause for a moment. What if that perception is an illusion? What if no one, not even the person who hurt you most, is your true enemy? From the Buddhist perspective, there is only one real adversary, and it doesn't have a face, a name, or an address. That adversary is ignorance, the blindness of the mind that makes us misperceive reality. Picture a battlefield. Two armies face each other, each convinced the other side is evil. They clash with weapons, shedding blood for a cause. But if you step back, you see a tragic irony. Both sides are driven by the same fear, the same misunderstanding, the same ignorance. The soldiers are not truly enemies. They are victims of the same shadow that clouds their vision. And isn't life itself a kind of battlefield? Not always with guns or swords, but with words, emotions, and silent grudges. We declare war on others without realizing the war is born within us, created by the ignorance that makes us believe we are separate, divided, and alone. Buddhism calls this ignorance avidya or avijja. It is the root of suffering, the poison that feeds anger and craving. Because we don't see things clearly, we create stories. That person insulted me. That person is my enemy. I must protect myself against them. But look closer. Is that person truly your enemy? Or is it their ignorance speaking through them? And when you react with anger, whose ignorance is speaking then? Think of a child throwing a tantrum. They scream, they kick, they cry as if the world is against them. Do we call that child an enemy? No, we recognize the immaturity, the lack of understanding. We see ignorance at work. And strangely enough, the same principle applies to adults. When someone lashes out, when they harm or insult, it is not their essence that attacks. It is their ignorance, their blindness, their pain. This is why the Buddha never treated anyone as an enemy, even those who tried to harm him. Take the story of Devadatta, his own cousin, who attempted to kill him out of jealousy. Most of us would hold a grudge forever, but the Buddha saw differently. He recognized that Devadatta was blinded by ignorance, enslaved by craving and anger. The true enemy wasn't Devadatta, it was the ignorance controlling him. When you begin to see this, life changes. The people you once called enemies become mirrors. They reflect the parts of you still trapped in anger, still vulnerable to hurt. They become unknowing teachers, showing you where your practice of patience and compassion is incomplete. It's not easy, of course. The ego craves villains. It wants someone to blame, someone to fight, someone to be the other. Without an enemy, ego feels naked, exposed, but wisdom sees through the illusion. Wisdom whispers, there is no enemy, there is only ignorance. Let's bring this down to everyday life. Imagine you're driving and someone cuts you off recklessly. Your first thought might be, what an idiot, they're against me, disrespecting me. But look again. Perhaps they are rushing to a hospital. Perhaps their mind is clouded with worry, stress, or anger. What you meet on the road is not an enemy, but ignorance. And if you respond with rage, your own ignorance joins the dance. Or think of arguments at home. A spouse says something sharp, a parent criticizes unfairly, a child refuses to listen. It feels personal. It feels like an attack. But is it truly? Or is it simply the force of ignorance moving through them, just as it moves through you when you lash out? Here lies the profound truth. When we fight people, we feed the cycle of hostility. When we recognize ignorance as the real adversary, compassion arises. We stop fighting faces and start confronting shadows. And compassion is not weakness, it's clarity. It is the courage to see that beneath every harsh word and hostile action, there is a suffering mind clouded by ignorance. Once you see this, you no longer meet an enemy. You meet a fellow traveler who has lost their way. This realization doesn't mean we allow harm or tolerate injustice passively. Boundaries still matter, but even when we stand firm, we can do so without hatred. We can protect ourselves without creating an enemy. We can correct others without condemning them. The Buddha compared ignorance to darkness. Imagine entering a pitch-black room. You bump into furniture, you stumble, you fall. Do Do you curse the room as your enemy? No. You realize the problem is the lack of light. In the same way, the people who seem like our enemies are stumbling in darkness, and sometimes so are we. So the first step is clear: to stop seeing people as enemies and start seeing ignorance as the true adversary. Because the moment you shift this perception, something extraordinary happens. The fire of hatred begins to cool. Compassion awakens. You are no longer chained to the cycle of blame and resentment. And from this shift, a deeper journey begins. The journey of understanding how ignorance works, how it hides behind our thoughts and feelings, how it turns friends into foes. To see this clearly is to move one step closer to freedom. If ignorance is the real adversary, why do we so often mistake people for enemies? It's because the human mind is quick to judge, quick to label, and even quicker to protect its fragile sense of self. Whenever we feel threatened, the mind constructs a story. That person is against me. They want to harm me. They are my enemy. But pause for a moment. Who decided they were the enemy? Was it reality, or was it the story our mind created? Consider this. Two neighbors disagree over a small piece of land. One believes the fence is on their property, the other believes it isn't. At first, it's just a difference of opinion. But then suspicion creeps in. Each begins to think the other is greedy, dishonest, untrustworthy. Words are exchanged. Soon the neighbor is no longer a person, they are the enemy next door. And yet the land itself hasn't changed. What changed was the story. What changed was perception. We humans have been doing this for centuries. Entire nations have gone to war not simply because of resources or territory, but because of the label enemy. Once we attach that word to a person or a group, our minds justify any amount of anger, hatred, even violence. The word becomes a prison, locking us into a narrow view. But here's the truth. No human being is born an enemy. A baby does not enter this world carrying hatred in its heart. Enemies are manufactured by fear, by misunderstanding, by ignorance. Let's bring it closer to home. Think about your own life. Who comes to mind when you hear the word enemy? Is it an old rival, a critical boss, a former friend who betrayed you? Now ask yourself, were they truly born your enemy, or did something happen? A misunderstanding, a clash of desires, a moment of ignorance that turned them into one in your eyes. Most of the time, what we call an enemy is nothing more than a reflection of our wounded ego. Someone said something that hurt our pride. Someone stood in the way of what we wanted. Someone reminded us of a part of ourselves we don't like. And instead of looking within, the mind projects outward. You are my enemy. Buddhism teaches that this projection is one of the greatest illusions. The Buddha explained that what we see in others is often just the play of our own attachments and aversions. Like a mirror, others reflect our hidden fears, our unhealed wounds, our unexamined ignorance. The so-called enemy is often just the surface where our own suffering is painted. Imagine holding a mirror with a crack. Whatever you see in it will look distorted. If you don't realize the mirror is cracked, you'll think the problem lies in the face it reflects. That's what happens when ignorance distorts perception. We mistake the distortion for the truth, and suddenly a fellow human being becomes a sworn enemy. There's a famous Zen story about two monks who were walking through a village. A man insulted them, calling them fools and frauds. One monk grew furious, clenching his fists, ready to fight. The other simply smiled and walked on. Later, the angry monk asked, "How could you let him speak that way to us? Aren't you offended?" The calm monk replied, "If someone offers you a gift and you refuse to accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The point is clear. The insult was not truly an enemy, it was only words. The real battle was within the mind of the offended monk. This story reveals something important. Enemies are often made, not found. They are born in the gap between what we expect and what reality gives us. They arise when our pride is wounded, when our desires are blocked, when our fears are triggered. And yet the person across from us is not the true foe. They are simply the stage where our inner conflict is being played out. Think about the last argument you had. Maybe it was with a friend, a partner, or someone at work. Replay it in your mind. Was the other person really your enemy, Or were they just defending their own view, their own needs, their own fears, just as you were? Beneath the clash of words, weren't you both simply trying to protect the same fragile sense of self? When we see this clearly, the word enemy begins to dissolve. Instead of enemies, we see humans, each caught in their own web of ignorance just like us. And this realization brings a powerful shift. Because if the enemy isn't really out there, but inside the mind, then the battleground changes. Instead of fighting people, we can begin addressing the ignorance that fuels misunderstanding. Instead of feeding hatred, we can cultivate wisdom. The next step is to look more deeply into this ignorance itself. What is it? How does it arise? And why does it have so much power to turn friends into foes, families into strangers, and neighbors into enemies? That is where our journey now leads. To uncover the hidden root of conflict, the silent force that distorts perception and blinds the heart, the force Buddhism calls ignorance. If enemies are not truly people but illusions created by the mind, then what exactly is behind the illusion? What is this hidden force that makes us misjudge, misperceive, and mislabel others as foes? Buddhism calls it ignorance, the most subtle, the most dangerous, and the most underestimated poison of the human heart. Ignorance doesn't look like a weapon. It doesn't shout. It doesn't storm through the door with fury. Instead, it works in silence. It seeps into perception like dust on a mirror, blurring everything we see. And because the mirror is cloudy, we mistake the distortion for truth. We see someone's face and imagine hostility where there is none. We hear a word and twist its meaning to confirm our fears. We feel slighted, rejected, diminished, when in reality, the offense exists only in our interpretation. This is the quiet work of ignorance. It convinces us that what we see is real, when in fact we are looking through a veil. The Buddha described ignorance as the first link in the chain of dependent origination, the starting point of suffering itself. From ignorance comes craving, from craving comes grasping, and from grasping comes endless conflict and pain. In other words, ignorance is not just one problem among many. It is the root from which all other problems grow. Imagine a tree. Its branches are anger, greed, jealousy, and fear. Its leaves are the conflicts we face every day, arguments, rivalries, wars. But if you dig down to the soil, you'll find the root that feeds it all: ignorance. As long as that root remains alive, the tree will keep producing new branches, new leaves, new suffering. So what is ignorance truly? It is not simply not knowing. It is misknowing. It is seeing impermanence but clinging as if things will last forever. It is witnessing suffering but chasing the same desires that create it. It is believing the self is separate, solid, independent, when in reality everything is interdependent, ever-changing without a fixed core. Ignorance is like wearing colored glasses without realizing it. The world looks tinted, but you think that's just the way reality is. You mistake the filter for the truth. Let's bring this closer to everyday life. Imagine two friends. One forgets to return a phone call. The other immediately thinks, they don't care about me anymore. Maybe they are angry. Maybe they are replacing me with someone else. Within hours, resentment grows. The friendship feels poisoned. And yet perhaps the forgotten call was nothing more than busyness, distraction, or fatigue. The enemy was never the friend. It was the ignorance in the mind interpreting events through fear and insecurity. Or think of a couple arguing. One says something careless, the other reacts with hurt, assuming malice. But often the wound is not in the words themselves, but in the ignorance of assuming intent. In truth, both sides are blind, each stumbling in the dark of their own perceptions. This blindness is universal. It doesn't matter how educated, wealthy, or powerful someone is. Without wisdom, we are all susceptible. A scholar can still misjudge a friend. A leader can still mistake an ally for an enemy. A parent can still misinterpret the silence of a child. That's why Buddhism calls ignorance one of the three poisons, along with greed and hatred. But unlike the other two, ignorance is the most difficult to notice, because it hides in plain sight. Greed burns, hatred seethes, ignorance, it just whispers, "This is reality, trust me." And we believe it. The most dangerous wars are not fought with guns, but with illusions born of ignorance. Nations have destroyed each other because leaders could not see clearly. Families have broken apart because misunderstandings were taken as truth. Friends have turned into enemies because ignorance painted their actions in false colors. And here is the paradox. The more we are blinded by ignorance, the more convinced we are that we see clearly. That is its ultimate trick. But there is good news. Darkness cannot withstand light, and ignorance cannot withstand awareness. The Buddha taught that once ignorance is exposed, once we begin to question our perceptions, its power starts to crumble. The veil lifts, even if only slightly, and we begin to see. Maybe the enemy I feared was only a story in my mind. Maybe the conflict I carried was just a misunderstanding. Maybe beneath it all there was no enemy at all. The path then is not to destroy enemies, but to illuminate ignorance, to shine the light of wisdom on the shadows of the mind. And this is not a lofty goal for monks alone. It is the task of every human being who wishes to live in peace. Because if ignorance is the root, then the only way to stop the endless cycle of enemies is to recognize it, confront it, and transform it. So the question becomes, how exactly does ignorance shape conflict? How does it turn ordinary disagreements into battles and strangers into lifelong foes? To understand this, we must look at the mechanics of ignorance, the ways it twists perception, distorts truth, and fuels hostility. That is where our journey now turns. Ignorance may be invisible, but its effects are not. It's like the wind, you can't see it directly, yet you watch trees bend, roofs collapse, and waves crash because of its force. In the same way, ignorance bends the human mind, warps perception, and unleashes conflict. But how does this happen? How does something so subtle create such chaos? The first way is misperception. Ignorance makes us see what isn't there and miss what is. A simple glance, a misunderstood word, a forgotten text message. These small things become weapons in the hands of a distorted mind. Think about how many fights begin not with reality but with assumption. Someone doesn't smile at you and ignorance whispers, they must dislike you. Someone disagrees with you and ignorance hisses, they want to humiliate you. Before you know it, a relationship is poisoned, not by truth, but by the story ignorance tells. The second way is ego identification. Ignorance convinces us that we are separate, solid, and permanent beings. It attaches us to the fragile fortress of me and mine. The moment someone threatens that fortress, even unintentionally, we feel attacked. If someone criticizes your work, you feel they are criticizing you. If someone challenges your opinion, you feel your very worth is on trial. Ignorance blurs the line between who we are and the temporary roles we play, turning every disagreement into a personal battle. And from that false sense of self comes endless conflict. Two egos collide like storms, each defending its illusion of permanence. The third way ignorance fuels conflict is through forgetting cause and effect. We lash out without realizing that anger will return as suffering. We grasp without seeing that greed creates more emptiness. We blame others, forgetting that our perception shapes our reality. A person blinded by ignorance may strike someone in anger, not seeing that this act will plant seeds of resentment, which will eventually return to them like a storm they cannot escape. Wars, too, are born this way. Leaders blinded by ignorance act without seeing the karmic waves they unleash across generations. Let's step into a simple story. A father comes home after a hard day. Exhausted, burdened, and distracted, he barely responds to his child's excitement. The child feels rejected, hurt, unloved. The next day, the child withdraws. The father, seeing this, feels unappreciated, even disrespected. Resentment grows on both sides. But notice, the father was not truly an enemy to the child, nor the child to the father. The real culprit was ignorance, the failure to see each other's state clearly. One saw rejection where there was only exhaustion. The other saw disrespect where there was only sadness. The result? Conflict. Now expand this to the world stage. Nations misinterpret each other's actions. A defensive move is seen as aggression. A gesture of pride is mistaken for a threat. Ignorance multiplies assumptions, fuels suspicion, and soon entire peoples are dragged into war. Millions suffer, all because of a blindness at the root of human perception. The Buddha taught that anger never arises by itself. It always needs a seed, and that seed is ignorance. Ignorance says, "I am separate, you are different, therefore you are a threat." And from that seed, anger blossoms, hatred grows, violence erupts. But what happens when wisdom enters? When we see that we are not separate but interconnected, not permanent but ever-changing? Then the seed cannot take root. Without ignorance, anger has no soil in which to grow. This is why Buddhism never blames people themselves, but the ignorance that drives them. Just as we don't hate the wind for knocking over a tree, we don't have to hate the person blinded by ignorance. We can address their actions, yes. We can stand against harm, yes. But we do not need to create enemies out of human beings. Because the real enemy is not the person. It is the ignorance that makes them see wrongly, speak harshly, act blindly. Think of it like this. Imagine two people in a dark room. One stumbles into the other, causing pain. The second person retaliates, thinking the stumble was intentional. A fight breaks out. But the truth is, the darkness was the cause. If the light had been on, there would have been no collision, no conflict, no fight. Ignorance is that darkness. And until we see it for what it is, we will keep stumbling into each other, mistaking accidents for attacks, differences for threats, and misunderstandings for enemies. But there is a way out. If we can learn to see through ignorance, if we can pause before reacting, if we can question our assumptions, then the cycle of conflict begins to break. This is the power of awareness. It shines like light into the dark room, showing us that the enemy we feared was only a shadow. And once we begin to see through ignorance, something remarkable happens. The people we once labeled as enemies start to appear in a new light. We begin to sense their pain, their confusion, their humanity. And from that seeing, compassion is born. So the question now becomes, if ignorance creates enemies through blindness, how can we shift our perspective? How can we learn to see not just our own pain, but the pain behind the eyes of those we once called foes? The next step is to explore a new vision, one that sees through another's perspective, to move from fear to empathy, to ask not, why are they my enemy? But rather, what suffering makes them act this way? Imagine standing face to face with the person you dislike most. Maybe it's someone who insulted you, someone who betrayed you, someone who made your life harder. The very sight of them may tighten your chest, raise your defenses, spark the thought, this person is my enemy. But what if just for a moment you could see through their eyes? What if you could slip inside their mind and glimpse the fears, the wounds, the struggles that drive their actions? Suddenly, the picture changes. The harsh words, the selfish choices, the hurtful actions, they no longer appear as deliberate cruelty. Instead, they reveal themselves as the cries of a suffering being, blinded by ignorance, doing the best they can with the little clarity they have. The Buddha taught that every action, no matter how harmful, arises from causes and conditions. A person who lashes out is not born an enemy. They are shaped by pain, confusion, and ignorance. If we could see the whole story behind their anger, we might feel less hatred and more understanding. Think of a dog barking viciously behind a fence. At first, you see only aggression, but then you notice the dog is chained, starving, wounded. Does your anger remain the same, or does pity begin to soften it? Humans are no different. Behind every hostile face is a history we cannot see, fears unspoken, traumas unresolved, ignorance unrecognized. There's an old saying in Buddhist circles, hatred never ceases by hatred. Hatred only ceases by love. But love is not born from naivety, it's born from understanding. And understanding begins when we dare to look through the other's eyes. Take the story of Angulimala, the feared bandit who once murdered hundreds. To most, he was the embodiment of evil. But when the Buddha met him, he didn't see a monster. He saw a man consumed by ignorance, trapped by conditions beyond his awareness. With compassion, the Buddha reached out, And Angulimala, touched by that vision, laid down his weapon and became a monk. This story teaches us something profound. Even those we label as enemies carry the seed of transformation. But that seed only sprouts when someone sees them not with hatred, but with empathy. Let's bring this closer to daily life. Think about the person you find most difficult. Maybe a boss who constantly criticizes. Maybe a relative who always stirs drama. Maybe a neighbor who makes life unbearable. If you could see through their eyes, what would you find? Perhaps the boss grew up in an environment where nothing was ever good enough, and now they repeat the same harshness. Perhaps the relative feels unseen, unloved, and tries to grasp attention the only way they know. Perhaps the neighbor lives in constant frustration, carrying burdens you'll never know. Their actions may still be harmful, but when you glimpse the suffering beneath, something inside you shifts. Anger loosens its grip. Hatred softens into compassion. This does not mean you excuse harm. It doesn't mean you allow others to mistreat you. Boundaries remain important, but the way you see the person changes. They are no longer a monster in your story. They are a fellow human being caught in the same net of ignorance and suffering that traps us all. When we see through the enemy's eyes, we discover a secret. The so-called enemy is not against us, they are against themselves. Their ignorance hurts them first, and we simply meet the overflow of their pain. Imagine what would happen if we lived this way, truly seeing through the other's perspective. Wars would not ignite so easily. Families would not shatter so quickly. Friendships would not end so harshly, because before reacting we would pause and ask, what pain is driving them? What ignorance is clouding their vision? This pause is everything. It is the seed of wisdom. It is the beginning of peace. Buddhism often compares compassion to water. Anger is fire, it burns, it spreads, it destroys. But water cools, soothes, heals. When you see through the enemy's eyes, you pour water on the flames of hostility. You don't deny the fire, but you refuse to feed it. And something miraculous happens. Sometimes the so-called enemy feels this shift. They may not change overnight, but the energy between you transforms. A fight loses its fuel. A relationship begins to thaw. A cycle of hostility quietly dissolves. So ask yourself, who in your life feels like an enemy right now? Picture them clearly. Then close your eyes and step into theirs. Imagine their childhood, their struggles, their hidden fears. See them not as a villain, but as a fellow traveler, lost, stumbling, blinded by ignorance, just like you have been many times before. If you can do this, even for a moment, you'll touch the essence of Buddhist compassion. You'll see that behind every enemy's face is the same longing we all share. The longing to be happy, to be free from suffering. And once you see that, the line between enemy and friend begins to blur. What remains is only humanity, fragile and beautiful, waiting to be understood. But this vision is not enough on its own. Seeing through another's eyes is the first step. The next step is transformation, learning how to turn the energy of anger and hostility into the strength of patience and the warmth of compassion. And that is where the path now leads. Hatred feels powerful. It surges like fire in the chest, it sharpens the tongue, it stiffens the body. For a moment, it convinces us that we are strong, that we are protecting ourselves. But look closer and you'll see the truth. Hatred is not power. Hatred is weakness disguised as strength. The Buddha compared hatred to picking up a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at another. Who gets burned first? Always the one holding the coal. That is what hatred does. It scorches us before it ever touches the one we aim it at. And yet when we're wounded, when we've been wronged, hatred feels almost automatic. Someone lies to us and resentment rises. Someone betrays us and rage follows. Someone insults us and the mind clings to revenge. It feels natural, but Buddhism whispers a different truth. Natural does not always mean wise. The real question is not, how do I get rid of hatred instantly? It is, how can I transform this hatred into something that heals instead of destroys? Transformation begins with recognition. When hatred appears, most of us either deny it, pretend we're not angry, or indulge it, letting it spill out in words and actions. But the middle way is to simply notice. This is hatred. This is how it feels in the body. This is how it clouds the mind. Awareness shines a light, and once hatred is seen, it begins to lose its grip. The second step is understanding. Hatred feeds on a story. They hurt me. They are evil. They deserve my anger. But when we pause, when we breathe, when we look deeper, the story cracks open. We begin to see ignorance at work, theirs and ours. We see how their actions were driven by confusion, fear, or suffering. And we see how our hatred is driven by our own wounded pride, our own misunderstanding of permanence, self, and control. With this seeing, hatred begins to soften. It has nothing to cling to anymore. There is a powerful practice in Buddhism called metta, or loving-kindness meditation. In its simplest form, it is the gentle repetition of wishes. May I be safe, may I be happy, may I live with ease. Then extending outward, may you be safe, may you be happy, may you live with ease. At first, directing these words toward an enemy feels impossible. It may even feel fake. But over time, something shifts. Hatred cannot survive when the heart learns to wish well, even to those who have caused harm. Slowly, the poison turns into medicine. The great monk Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "When you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you do not blame the lettuce. You look for reasons. Perhaps it needs more water, less sun, or better soil." People are like that. If someone is difficult, we don't blame them, we try to understand why. Hatred blames, understanding inquires. Hatred condemns, understanding heals. Hatred isolates, understanding reconnects. But here is the paradox. Transforming hatred into understanding does not mean becoming passive. It does not mean allowing abuse or surrendering your dignity. Rather, it means responding from clarity instead of reactivity. You can set boundaries with compassion. You can say no with firmness but without venom. You can walk away without slamming the door in anger. When hatred is transformed, the energy that once burned is no longer wasted. It becomes strength, strength to forgive, strength to endure, strength to protect peace within yourself. History gives us shining examples. Think of Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years. He had every reason to hate, every reason to seek revenge. But when he walked free, he chose reconciliation instead of retaliation. Why? Because he understood that hatred would only continue the cycle of oppression. Understanding was the only way to break it. Or think of the Buddha himself. When insulted by a man consumed with anger, instead of retaliating, the Buddha simply asked, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, who does it belong to?" The man, confused, answered, "To the one who offers it." The Buddha smiled. "Then I do not accept your anger. It remains with you." This is the essence of transformation, not fighting fire with fire, but refusing to feed it at all. In your own life, consider someone who has wronged you deeply. Feel the sting of that memory. Then ask, what do I want more, revenge or peace? Because you cannot have both. Hatred may feel satisfying in the short term, but peace is the treasure that lasts. When you choose understanding, you do not excuse their actions. You free yourself from being chained to them. You cut the cord that hatred ties between you and the other. You reclaim your energy for wisdom, for love, for life itself. Hatred is heavy. Understanding is light. Hatred blinds. Understanding reveals. Hatred divides. Understanding unites. And every time you transform hatred into understanding, even in small ways, you contribute to something larger than yourself. You become part of humanity's healing, part of the slow turning of the wheel away from suffering and toward compassion. So the next time hatred rises, don't fear it and don't fuel it. See it, understand it, and gently guide it into something higher. Let it teach you patience. Let it teach you strength. Let it teach you compassion. Because hatred is not the end of the story. With awareness and wisdom, hatred becomes the doorway, leading us deeper into the heart of understanding and closer to the truth that no one is our true enemy, only ignorance. Grand ideas and profound philosophies mean little if they cannot touch the ground of daily life. We may nod our heads when hearing about compassion, forgiveness, or understanding. But when the alarm clock rings late, when traffic clogs the road, when a coworker snaps at us, all those lofty teachings can vanish like smoke. This is why Buddhism insists on practice, not once a week, not only in temples, but in the simple rhythm of everyday living. So how do we turn the insight no one is our true enemy, only ignorance, into something we can actually live? Let's walk into ordinary moments and discover how wisdom breathes there. 1. The pause before reaction. The first piece of wisdom is deceptively simple: pause. When anger rises, when irritation surges, we often move too quickly. Our mouths speak before our hearts catch up. The pause is our shield. Take a breath, feel the body, notice the heat of the emotion. That single pause can transform what might have been a hurtful remark into silence or even into kindness. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff. One step forward is a fall, but one step back is safety. The pause is that step back. 2. Shifting the question. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" ask, "What pain might be driving them?" This shift doesn't excuse their behavior, but it reframes it. Suddenly, you're not the center of the storm. You're an observer seeking to understand, and from understanding grows patience. 3. Turning enemies into teachers. The Buddha once said that our enemies are our greatest teachers. Why? Because they reveal the places where our patience is thin, where our pride is fragile, where our compassion has limits. When someone annoys you, instead of thinking, "Why won't they stop?" try asking, "What is this moment teaching me about myself?" The world becomes a classroom, and every enemy becomes an unexpected guide toward growth. 4. Practicing metta in small doses. You don't have to sit for an hour in meditation hall to practice loving kindness. You can do it in line at the grocery store. You can do it when passing someone on the street. Silently think, "May you be safe, may you be happy." It may feel small, but over time, these silent wishes rewire the heart. Slowly, it becomes harder to see anyone as an enemy because the habit of goodwill has taken root. 5. Boundaries without hatred. Wisdom is not blind tolerance. If someone causes harm repeatedly, compassion does not mean staying silent. But there's a difference between saying "this must stop" with hatred and saying it with clarity and firmness. Practical wisdom means learning that boundaries can be acts of compassion too, both for ourselves and for the one causing harm, because allowing harmful behavior to continue only feeds ignorance. 6. Remembering impermanence. Every conflict feels eternal when we're in it, but nothing lasts. The coworker who glares at you today might be gone tomorrow. The argument with your spouse may fade by nightfall. When we remember impermanence, we loosen our grip. Why cling to hatred over something that will pass like clouds across the sky? 7. Returning to the breath. Whenever confusion overwhelms, the simplest anchor is the breath. Inhale, exhale. The breath does not belong to enemy or friend. It belongs to life itself. Returning to the breath is returning to neutrality, to presence, to clarity. It sounds too simple, but often the deepest wisdom hides in simplicity. At the start of each day, take a moment to set a quiet intention. Today, I will not let ignorance rule my actions. Today, I will choose understanding over hatred. This intention is like planting a seed in the soil of the mind. Throughout the day, when storms come, you'll remember the seed you planted, and it will guide you back to wisdom. Practical wisdom is not dramatic. It doesn't look like a sudden enlightenment under a bodhi tree. More often, it looks like a gentle smile instead of a harsh word. It looks like silence instead of gossip. It looks like choosing patience in traffic instead of honking the horn. And yet, these small acts accumulate. Drop by drop, the bucket fills. Moment by moment, ignorance weakens. Slowly, we train ourselves to see clearly, to respond wisely, to live compassionately. The truth is, daily life is the perfect training ground. Every irritation is a chance to practice patience. Every conflict is a chance to practice understanding. Every encounter is a chance to practice compassion. And when we live this way, something shifts. Enemies disappear, not because the world changes, but because our way of seeing changes. So as you step into the ordinary moments of your life, into conversations, routines, frustrations, remember, wisdom is not waiting in some faraway temple. It is waiting in the pause before words, in the kindness of small gestures, in the courage to see ignorance instead of enemies. And when wisdom walks with you in daily life, the teachings of Buddhism stop being abstract philosophy. They become living truth. But wisdom alone is not the whole journey. Wisdom must be joined with compassion, the heart's deep response to suffering. And together, they form the true antidote to ignorance. At the heart of every conflict, every war, every broken relationship lies the same misunderstanding, the belief that another person is our enemy. But pause and look deeper. Strip away the labels, the anger, the wounds, and what do you see? Not an enemy, only ignorance. Ignorance is the root that twists human vision. It blinds us to interconnection, tricks us into believing we are separate, convinces us that harming others will somehow secure our own happiness. When we mistake ignorance for a person, we fight the wrong battle. We spend our lives wrestling with shadows instead of facing the real cause of suffering. Think of two men locked in combat. Each sees the other as the enemy. But if you peel back the surface, you discover both are prisoners of the same force, ignorance. One is blinded by greed, the other by pride. Both are bound by delusion. Both are wounded by fear. They strike at each other, not realizing they are fighting their own shadows. The Buddha once said, if you truly understood, you would never be angry. Because anger always arises from ignorance, our ignorance of impermanence, of the nature of suffering, of the fact that others act not from malice alone, but from their own confusion and pain. Let's make this personal. When someone insults you, your first reaction might be, they hate me, they are against me. But if you could see into their mind, you might discover they are carrying years of insecurity, shame, or trauma. Their insult is less about you and more about the weight they cannot carry. The enemy is not them, it is the ignorance whispering inside them. And here's the hidden truth, that same ignorance whispers inside us too. Every time we lash out in anger, every time we cling to jealousy, every time we refuse to forgive, ignorance is at work. The enemy is not out there, it is within. This realization changes everything. If no person is truly our enemy, then revenge loses its meaning. Hatred loses its justification. The battlefield is no longer between me and them, it is within our own mind. The true practice becomes this: to uproot ignorance with wisdom, to dissolve hatred with compassion, to replace delusion with clarity. There is a story told in the Buddhist tradition of a monk traveling through a village where people mocked him, threw stones, and spat at him. When asked why he did not grow angry, the monk replied, "They are like sick children who do not know what they do. Would I hate a child for being sick? No, I only wish for them to heal." This is the essence of the teaching. We do not have enemies, only beings trapped in ignorance. And our role is not to fight them, but to help illuminate the darkness with patience, with compassion, with wisdom. But some may ask, if there are no enemies, then why do people harm? Why do wars exist? Why is there so much cruelty in the world? The answer is not denial, it is perspective. Cruelty is real, harm is real, but its source is always ignorance. When nations rise against nations, it is ignorance of interdependence. When families fracture, it is ignorance of communication and forgiveness. When individuals lash out, it is ignorance of their own suffering. See clearly and you stop confusing the smoke with the fire. The smoke is the person's actions. The fire is ignorance. If we fight only the smoke, it keeps returning. If we extinguish the fire, the smoke disappears on its own. So how do we live this truth? By training the mind to see beyond the surface. When anger arises, ask yourself, is it truly this person I am fighting, or is it ignorance at work? When resentment burns, ask, what delusion is fueling this pain? These questions shift the battlefield inward where the real enemy hides. And here lies the paradox. Once you see ignorance as the only enemy, compassion naturally flows. Because how can you hate someone for being blind? You don't despise a blind person for stumbling. You guide them, you forgive their missteps. In the same way, when you see others blinded by ignorance, hatred turns to compassion almost on its own. The great gift of this teaching is freedom. freedom from blame, freedom from endless cycles of revenge, freedom from carrying the heavy burden of enemies in our hearts. Because the moment you realize there are no enemies, only ignorance, the world transforms. The man who insults you becomes a teacher of patience. The rival who competes with you becomes a reminder of your own ego. The stranger who harms you becomes an opportunity to practice compassion. Life stops being a battlefield and becomes a classroom. And what is the final lesson of this classroom? That ignorance is not permanent. Just as darkness vanishes with light, ignorance vanishes with wisdom. Every act of compassion, every moment of mindfulness, every spark of understanding adds light to the world. And in that light, enemies dissolve. Only fellow beings remain, struggling, suffering, but also capable of awakening. So carry this truth gently in your heart. No one is your true enemy. Not your rival, not your critic, not even the one who harms you most deeply. The only enemy is ignorance. And once you see this, you will stop fighting people and start fighting delusion. You will stop wasting energy on hatred and begin investing it in compassion. You will stop dividing the world into us and them and start seeing only we. This is the wisdom that liberates the heart. But one step still remains. Every journey needs closure, a return, a deep breath that ties together all the insights. And that final step awaits us in the last chapter. So we arrive at the end of this journey. We began with enemies, shadows looming large in our hearts. We carried their weight, feared their presence, and let them steal our peace. But along the way, something shifted. We peeled back the layers, and the face of the enemy began to dissolve. What remained was not a monster, but a mirror. Not a villain, but a teacher. Every insult we endured became a lesson in patience. Every betrayal became a lesson in forgiveness. Every rival who stirred our jealousy became a lesson in humility. Every conflict revealed to us the silent teacher, ignorance, and the path to wisdom through compassion. What we once called enemies were never here to destroy us. They were here to awaken us. Without them, would we have discovered the depth of our own patience? Would we have uncovered the strength of compassion? Would we have tasted the sweetness of letting go? The Buddha never taught us to run from enemies, nor to crush them. Instead, he showed us that those who challenge us the most are often our greatest guides. For they strip away our illusions, confront our ego, and force us to practice the very truths we claim to believe. Think of the hardest person in your life, the one who angers you, hurts you, or makes your heart heavy. Now imagine them not as an obstacle, but as a teacher wearing a difficult mask. Every time they push your buttons, they are giving you a lesson in self-mastery. Every time they wound you, they are giving you an invitation to heal deeper. The mask may look like hatred, but behind it is a teaching. In this light, enemies become sacred. They are not against you, they are for your awakening. They remind you of the work you still must do inside yourself. They challenge you to rise beyond your old patterns, to embody the wisdom you admire, to live the compassion you speak of. And isn't this the essence of the spiritual path? To see that nothing in life is wasted. To see that every person, every circumstance, whether soft or sharp, is here to teach. When we embrace this, life no longer feels like a battlefield. It feels like a school where each encounter is a lesson and every person is a teacher in disguise. The critic teaches you humility. The betrayer teaches you forgiveness. The rival teaches you detachment. The stranger who hurts you teaches you compassion. And the ones who love you teach you gratitude. All are teachers, all are necessary. This realization brings a profound freedom. You no longer live at the mercy of others' actions. Whether people praise you or condemn you, you remain steady because you know both are lessons. Whether life lifts you or throws you down, you remain grateful because both are teachers. Suddenly, enemies no longer exist. There is only learning, only growth, only awakening. And so let us carry this wisdom with us. The enemy was never the person. The enemy was ignorance. The battle was never out there. The battle was within. And the victory was never about defeating others. The victory was seeing clearly, loving deeply, and awakening fully. Take a breath. Let the weight of enemies slip from your shoulders. You don't need them anymore. You don't need to carry their faces, their words, their wounds in your heart. Instead, let them transform. Let them become your teachers and then bow to them, not with fear but with gratitude. For without them, you would not be who you are today. Without them, your wisdom would remain untested. Without them, your compassion would remain a dream. And so our journey ends where it truly begins, not with enemies but with teachers. Not with hatred but with understanding. Not with division but with unity. May you walk this path with courage. May you face life's teachers with an open heart. And may you discover, again and again, that what you once feared as an enemy was always your greatest guide to awakening. And if these words touch something deep within you, if you felt even a moment of stillness, of clarity, of compassion, then let this journey continue. This channel, Zen Buddhism Wisdom, is a space where we walk together through questions of life, suffering, and awakening. If you wish to keep nurturing wisdom, to keep discovering the calm beneath the noise, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe so that each teaching finds its way to you when you need it most. Share this message so others may also find peace where they once saw enemies. And leave your reflections in the comments, because your insights may be the very words someone else is waiting to hear. May our practice not end here but ripple outward, touching hearts, transforming lives, and reminding us all, there are no enemies, only teachers.